Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Mafia: The City of Lost Heaven for PC, Xbox, and PS2. This is a third-person shooter by Illusion Softworks. It was first released in 2002 for PC and then later on in 2004 for PS2 and Xbox. And at the time it received quite a bit of praise, particularly for the amount of realism that it has with regards to its world. And it's kind of an interesting game because Illusion Softworks is actually now 2K Czech. They're a Czech company, and they're trying to make an American gangster story set in the fictional city of Lost Heaven. So, the question there is, did they pull it off, and was this something that was praised more because we really didn't have all that many good gangster games back then, or what? Well, as far as the presentation goes, at the time it was pretty impressive. You have to keep in mind that this is a game from 2002, so the modeling being all blocky in a lot of spots, the animations being really spotty, a lot of that is due to it being from 2002. At the time, it looked pretty decent, but obviously it really hasn't aged well at all, particularly in regards to the animations and the texture quality. But again, at the time, it looked really impressive, and particularly because there weren't really all that many games that had this sort of large, open world to run around in. So, that's something to keep in mind when you go into this thing, although to the modern eye, obviously, it just does not look good at all. As for the sound design, they really dropped the ball here. The voice acting is serviceable at best, and at worst, outright terrible. In fact, a lot of the voices are really phoned in, they seem really cheesy, and just ridiculous voice acting. That sounds more like it was from the 90s than the more modern era, so that was really unpleasant. Even though they do have some actors who were actually in The Sopranos, their voice acting overall just isn't impressive and feels really flat and lifeless. The sound effects themselves are another thing that's kind of annoying because a lot of the gun sounds in particular just sound really wimpy. Or just odd. They don't really necessarily sound like guns very much. They sound just like a weird sound effect that they chose and doesn't really work out all that well. The music is pretty decent. It's fitting for the particular time setting, which is the 30s, but it's not really something that I personally like. Now, obviously there are going to be people out there who disagree with me with that, and that's perfectly fine, because, I mean, the music is not bad, it's just I don't particularly care for it myself. And it is fitting for the time, so I have to give them that. But obviously what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set in the 1930s in the fictional city of Lost Heaven. You play as Tommy Angelo, who at the beginning of the game is a taxi driver, and after a rather unpleasant encounter with some members of the Salieri crime family, eventually becomes one of the Don's top henchmen. And ultimately the story ends up being about his rise to prominence in the family, as he's telling it to a detective who he's trying to persuade to give him and his family protection in exchange for testifying against Salieri. The plot itself ends up being rather cliche in a lot of ways. You're doing a lot of things that you would pretty much expect a 1930s gangster to do, and ultimately the plot ends up being rather weak, partly because the characters themselves are weak. They're in a lot of ways one-dimensional, and you can't really get attached to them, at least I certainly couldn't. And so you don't necessarily care what happens to them in the plot itself. You're really more concerned about what you're actually doing in terms of gameplay. And the gameplay is split into basically two different things. The first is driving, the second is running around on the ground and just fighting. Now, the driving is what's going to take up a lot of time in this game. Partly because the cars in this game are really slow. It's the 1930s. They didn't really get very fast. And on top of that, the cars handle like they're made of lead. So you're going to have a hard time driving around in this game until you really get used to how these cars handle. And even better than that, they decided to up the ante with the realism on those and make you have to use manual gear shifting, including the clutch, which is frankly incredibly irritating because if you're like me and you've never actually driven a manual, then you're going to have issues because you don't really know what you're doing. There is a way to switch it over to auto shift, but I never really noticed that it helped. It seemed like it didn't run any better when I was doing the manual versus the auto, and it was just a mess. There's also a speed limiter in this game. You may be wondering why there's a speed limiter. Well, it's because you can get pulled over for speeding. Now, frankly, that's annoying. And when you're actually playing through this game and you're having to drive slowly for the most part, except when there's a chase scene or a race, it gets pretty irritating with how sluggish everything feels. And a lot of the driving just feels like padding. Partly because this open world really doesn't have much to do. Unless you're playing Freeride Extreme, you're not going to have any of this open world stuff to really fiddle around with. The story itself, the single player campaign, is an extremely linear experience. And so, it's basically just go here, do thing, and you're done. And on to the next level. Whereas with Freeride stuff, you're allowed to drive around the city and pretty much do whatever you want, but it's really not any better because they obviously didn't design the game around that. And the free riding itself feels really, really weak as a result. Which is a shame because they give you this wide environment to run around in and then don't use it. So, it's a shame. So what about the other part of the game, the shooting and fighting in general? Well, this is where things get kind of awkward, because if you've seen my video on this particular game that was a how to fail, then you know that the controls are kind of odd and take a lot of getting used to, particularly with regards to the melee and throwing. If you're in melee, you actually have to hold the button down to actually charge up your attack, and once it's up to the max of the bar, of course, you're going to do the most damage. But really being able to judge where the enemy is in relation to you and how close you are, or if you're close enough to actually hit them, or if you are actually within their arc or something like that. It's a surprisingly clunky system that does not work out very well in the end. And part of that is because you just feel like you can't really get accurate with the melee in this game. It feels more like you're just kind of flailing around like an idiot than anything else. Now, the shooting is a lot better in that respect. You do actually feel like you can use the weapons with some accuracy, even though the recoil on a lot of them is really ridiculous, and they feel rather underpowered. At least you can actually use those more effectively. But it's really weird being in this game and finding that certain weapons that you would expect to be pretty powerful don't really feel very powerful. Like the shotgun, for instance. In theory, it's powerful. And if you're really close, then yes, it is. But if you're not really close, then it may take multiple hits in order to actually bring an enemy down, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, to be honest with you. Whereas something like a 45 versus a 38, the 38 seems to have ridiculous recoil and does a lot of damage, while the 45 doesn't really do all that much and takes a lot of hits to bring somebody down. There's not really a whole lot of consistency to it. In particular, it doesn't make any sense with a 38 versus a 45, because a 45 is going to just do more damage than a 38 is. It's basic ballistics there. So you have these systems which in theory work out okay, but in practice make the game feel half-baked. Like the shooting, for instance, the guns don't feel all that powerful, and you don't really feel like you're getting anywhere. You're having to blast a lot of rounds downrange in order to actually be able to bring enemies down, because it seems like they're bullet spongy in a lot of ways. Unless you get a lot of headshots. And the driving just is not fun, because cars from the 1930s just don't handle well. And then you have the plot itself, which just doesn't really do anything to grab you. And ultimately what ends up happening with this particular game is that it just isn't enjoyable. Which is a shame, because it had potential. They could have really gone somewhere with it, but they didn't. Now, there is a sequel, and the question there is whether they took the lessons they learned from this particular game and improved upon them in the sequel, but that's something for another video. This particular game, though, feels rather underwhelming. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.